Thanks, Chair. I wonder if I might ask Mr. Smith to begin with, if he's familiar with the government's impact assessment. I mean, I know it wasn't the current Transport Secretary; it was the previous one that commissioned it. Are you familiar with the conclusions of that?
No, I'm not. I'm sorry.
Well, basically, what it says is that well, it was intended specifically for transport. The current bill is more wide-ranging, but it says that there may be even more strikes as unions seek to be able to take. As unions see that their strikes are less effective because of the compulsory minimum standards. And in response, the government said an increased frequency of strikes following a minimum service level being introduced, this would reduce the overall impact effectiveness of the policy, although service levels would be higher than the baseline on a strike day. It could mean that an increased number of strikes could ultimately result in more adverse impacts in the long term, particularly in the hospitality sector.
Yeah.
So are you pointing this out to ministers, that there may be an unintended consequence of this minimum service levels bill?
We are clearly going into quite unknown territory here. The long-term consequences of which we will only know if and when these minimum service levels are ever implemented. I think echoing what Ms Nichols said, the desire must be to have negotiated settlements where people are happy to come to work, they want to come to work, they want to give their best, which virtually everybody in the rail industry does want to do. A volunteer is worth 10 pressed men, is often said, and I think it is true. And I think the consequences of this we would only see if they were actually, if this type of minimum service level was actually put into place. But it does seem like quite unknown territory.
So is your role, Mr. Smith, with Transport Focus, is it simply to, or not simply, is it basically to relay the results of consultations and responses from the public to ministers? Or is your role to advocate government policy?
Our job primarily is to make sure that the views of passengers are known by the decision makers, both in terms of the short-term views of their experience today and their longer-term views in terms of investment priorities for the future, which helps government and others make better investment decisions. If on areas around policy directly relating to passengers, such as compensation or whatever, we would put forward suggestions. In an area like this, which is, I think, a much more political area and a much more contested area, passengers want to see trains. How they're provided, I think they're probably much less concerned about. We've seen quite, on some routes, relatively high levels of service provision, and that's been good. And passengers want to see trains. How they're actually provided, under what terms and conditions, I think they're less concerned about, as long as they are provided safely. That's got to be the initial step of this, and that goes beyond simply the train and track. It's got to be the station staff as well. So I think the scope of these sorts of requirements would have to be broader than simply the operation of the train and track. It's got to be what happens at the station as well. Thinking of things like passenger assist for disabled passengers.
Well, I wanted to ask about that with disabled passengers, and you know, it's an issue that the committees took a particular interest in. And in fact, we've had some written representations to the committee this week from some of the train operators suggesting that they're outperforming their targets, although that's not the practical experience of people using the service. I just hope that information is being fed through to ministers. And I'm not being cynical here, but who appoints the chairman and the board members of Transport Focus?
The majority of the board members and the chair are appointed by the Secretary of State. In Wales and Scotland and London, there's slightly different arrangements. They appoint their own member.
So the politician appoints the board members and the chair?
They do, but... are
you reticent about criticising policy that the politician brings forward?
through 24 years of working in this area and for this organisation, we've remained an arm's length organisation that has been able to say what it needs to say to government, because otherwise we're no use. And we will continue to do that. So the fact that somebody has to appoint the chair and members has not affected what we say on behalf of passengers, but we absolutely firmly base what we say on insight and evidence always.
I'm sure, Chair, that there are alternative methods rather than direct appointment, you know, if we want to be diverse and inclusive, but maybe that's a separate inquiry. Thanks, Chair.